I'm more than happy to be in this panel with those valuable speakers, and we will try to get into more specifics about the steps that any company in private business will follow to go toward consolidating international IPO offerings. And we'll do a Q&A session afterwards. Please feel free to ask any more questions, convenient and inconvenient, about the public, internationally or in the UK, especially in the UK. Well, I like the presentations too much, but I would like to give the first, ask this first question to Nick first. And we will do 2 rounds of questions, one for each, and then we'll do a Q&A session. But Nick, if you can please cover the legal aspects of going public in the UK and critical success factors and the most critical development areas for international issuers that will make the legal side more clear from the participants' perspective.
Okay, sure. Just by way of introduction, so I am a capital markets partner in the London office of Dentons, and my practice is focused on taking emerging market, developing market companies public in London. So I've spent the better part of the last 20 years working in Russia, CIS, Central and Eastern Europe, Middle East, and in the last year, I spent a lot more time in Turkey talking to Turkish companies about coming to London. I think most relevant, it's been mentioned a few times here today already, I spent the better part of the beginning of last year, probably 6 months of last year in Istanbul. We had the privilege of working with DP Eurasia, bringing that to the London premium segment of the main market. Legal aspects of going public in the UK. I think the first thing, and I won't cover, as you can imagine, the topic, all legal aspects is quite a wide topic to cover on a panel discussion, so I'll just pick out a few things which, when we talk to clients about, typically require the most lead time, so things that really need to be thinking about very early on in the process. I think the first thing that we would talk to companies about is really whether or not they're considering an offshore or an onshore structure. I think Tim, in one of his slides earlier, in one of the boxes, right down at the very bottom, it spoke about float code. And really, what we talk to a company about, the decision facing a company right at the very beginning, is whether to reorganize the group so that what might be a Turkish headquarters is moved out of Turkey, with all of the incumbent difficulty of that. So changing management, moving management, or creating reporting lines up to a new top company. Or the alternative is leave the Turkish headquarters in Turkey. There are various inputs into that decision-making process. There are obviously legal and regulatory inputs, whether or not the group, the business, may be subject to restrictions in its financing documents, such as change of control clauses, which might prevent such a reorganization, putting a new company on top of the existing group. From an IPO consolidation perimeter for accounting, there may be an impact on that you would have to talk to your accountants about. There could be capital gains issues for the shareholders if you are altering the shareholding structure at the top. But there could also be very good business reasons for moving the group offshore, moving the headquarters offshore. It could be that actually at the time of the IPO, this is a good time to start thinking about, or it dovetails with a strategy of international expansion, which plays very well with the equity story of IPOing in London. But I think the main driver of that very first decision, whether to IPO from onshore or offshore, is really about the market that you're targeting and also the investors that you're targeting. And it's probably something that Axel will touch on a bit later as well. But what we as advisors play on and what we talk about a lot to clients about is the biggest attraction for issuers to come to the market in London is because of the depth of the pool of its liquidity. It's probably the third largest, it's probably one of the largest exchanges in the world, maybe after New York, Shanghai, with a significant amount of assets under management, which completely outstrips any of its European counterparts. And what that means for a company is some very solid and very liquid index tracking funds in the UK. So this is all really about indexation. And if a company can be a component of a particular index, particularly a valuable index like the FTSE All-Share Index, what that does for a company, it probably means that going into the index, when you become eligible for the index, you probably get a bump in valuation. And what it also assures you is liquidity going forward. And these are the two key points that companies are focused on in the aftermarket. There's one point about picking the venue for listing, but just as important, more important, is the aftermarket. How will we perform in the aftermarket? Because that will also affect how your shareholders are able to sell down and finally exit, if that is the strategy, the business. But indexation in London comes at a particular price. It is, to be part of the biggest indices, what that presupposes is that the company, such as similar to what we did for DP Eurasia, has to be part of the premium segment of the main market. And to be part of the premium segment of the main market, that immediately presupposes that the IPO that you're looking at is an offshore structure, not an onshore, not of a Turkish headquartered business, but offshore. There are other implications of doing a premium listing: increased investor protection, enhanced corporate governance, increased eligibility requirements. But the payoff is eligibility for the index. If there is a desire to still offshore the business, but really it's more aspirational to become part of the premium market, then you can do something, for example, that Global Ports did, and you still have a Turkish business headquartered offshore, but they do something called a standard share listing. So the standard share listing, again, you need to be headquartered in a country, so similar to a premium listing, headquartered in a country where share settlement is compatible with clearing your shares directly into Crest, which is the UK clearing system. But unlike the premium segment, the increased investor protection around that is not required. If there is no appetite to move the headquarters, and again, we're talking about transformative processes, and the IPO, with all of its incumbent parts of it, including movement of the headquarters offshore, this is a transformative process, and if there is no appetite to do that, then that's also okay. Turkish companies can still access the UK markets, and that would be through a GDR listing. And GDR listings we haven't seen for a while in Turkey. They are very not in vogue, and I think there's been a lack of any IPOs for the last 10 years, and then suddenly last year we had two very good ones come to market, not through a GDR. But it's not to say that the GDR isn't fit for purpose, and it still is a very viable instrument for any group, for any undertaking which is not yet at that level that is able to consider moving offshore, and there could be regulatory or even political reasons why you might not want to do that. I think once you decide on the market of listing, whether this is an offshore or an onshore structure, other points which sort of take a little bit more time for a company to think about before they really engage with bankers is really the board composition and what the management will look like. And that's typically driven by a couple of points. One is, particularly if you are moving the company offshore, will depend on maybe the tax requirements of the country where you go to. So, for example, in order to create substance in a particular country, there may be requirements that you have a minimum number of board directors who are nationals of the particular country or who are at least resident of the country. The other driving factor for board composition, board balance and independence is really market and investor expectation of compliance with the UK Corporate Governance Code. The UK Corporate Governance Code is something created by the Financial Reporting Council. It is not part of the FCA, it's not part of the UK regulator, but it's something that through the listing rules the UK regulator looks at and points to, particularly for premium listings. But what the listing rules say, whether this is for, and again just focusing on the main market here, but whether this is for a premium listing or a standard share listing or a GDR, there is no requirement, hard and fast rule, to comply fully with the Corporate Governance Code. What the requirement is, similar to a lot of jurisdictions, is that the company has to either complain with it or comply with it or explain any deviation from the code. But then this is where market expectation comes in. You have this cascade of expectation by investors, starting from a premium listing where market expectation would be full compliance with the UK code, and then down through a standard share listing and to a GDR listing. And when you get to the GDR listing, market expectation is actually that the company is probably not following the UK code and is probably only following any relevant governance code that's applicable in Turkey. At the very highest level, the implication of that for a premium listing would be, and full compliance with the UK code, would mean that the chairman would have to be an independent director. Excluding the chairman, at least half of the board would also have to be independent, which is quite, then this sort of puts into context the reason why this becomes a lead item in the IPO process. Because appointing a search firm at the time of kickoff of an IPO, and we've seen sort of the kickoff to actually floating could be 6 to 9 months. But to actually start an HR firm search for independent directors, which of the caliber and the strength that you need for the business, plus that may require also nationality requirements as well, it can definitely put a strain on that execution process if all of that is loaded simply from kickoff through to IPO. So we would always say that this is something that is well advised for a well executed IPO to be started a lot earlier. I think I don't know how much time I've taken. I think the last 2 points that I'll cover, which are the most obvious points in terms of a lawyer's work stream on an IPO, is diligence and the prospectus. So the prospectus is obviously, I think Chris was talking about all the propaganda and the sales documents with the glossy brochure that you take on the roadshow and you use as a marketing tool. But for the accountants and for the lawyers, this is the key liability document. This is the document to which statutory liability attaches, not only for the company, but in most circumstances also for the individual directors as well. Directors will be comforted through the provision of D&O insurance, but the document is still a liability document. The UKLA, which is the UK regulator which reviews the prospectus, it's important to note that when the UKLA stamps the prospectus, it's not signing off on the appropriateness of the investment. What it is saying by stamping the document is that disclosure of the business has been made in accordance with the rules. And where the lawyer's value add is here is to ensure that full disclosure is made, so that we can have those individual conversations with each board member, and bearing in mind some of the board members may have been onboarded within the very final months of the IPO process, so that we can have the conversation with the board members that we have sufficiently disclosed in the prospectus in order to mitigate any potential action from shareholders in the aftermarket based on the quality of disclosure in the prospectus. So I think the way that we are able to have that conversation with directors is through this very intrusive process that we call diligence. And what we really typically start very early on in the process with companies is we ask them to compile all of their company records and books into typically a virtual data room, which is opened up to the working group. And the working group will review and investigate all of those documents in order to get comfortable that what we have in the prospectus is materially accurate. And I think, again, speaking of long lead time and well-executed IPOs, we often find that the earlier on in the process, pre-engaging banks, pre-kickoff, that a company can put together a data room and allow their company counsel to look at that, the easier it is for us to be able to foresee well in advance of any problem actually becoming an impediment to executing the IPO. And again, because achieving that IPO window is a critical factor, and it's something that, although there are ways to mitigate it and to lengthen those IPO windows, these are market-led transactions, and missing the IPO window is not something that where the board wants to be.
Right, thank you very much for using the tangible language, not technical terms.
You're welcome.
Second question was security. So as we have discussed earlier, Turkish economy is driven by mostly capital businesses and private businesses. And like Mr. Humphrey has admitted, for the world round, it's a significant and very important portfolio for us. It's over 45% of our business private businesses. And we are receiving more questions about the public role, especially in the UK. And we know that we have a huge, extensive experience about international issues, and we have mentioned many IPO projects in the UK. But the companies in Turkey are similar to, I believe, all around the world. Given your tasks to complete in your presentation, may not know and may need guidance as to where to start, advanced investment planning, and you are referring to the corporate governance and the control structure of the companies for a successful IPO process. In addition to that, given your experience with international issues, what are the best ways, what are your advices to the companies who are considering an IPO abroad, and what are the most critical development areas for international issues that you have experienced?
Okay. I mean, that's a great question, and there's quite a lot of parts of that question, so I'll just break it down into a few areas where I see that Deloitte can add value to businesses. So if we first of all just take the market segments in terms of, in Turkey you've got lots of private businesses. So in the UK, lots of businesses that I work with start off being entrepreneurial private businesses, and we should all recognise that taking a premium listing on the UK Stock Exchange is an extremely high bar, and if you're a private entrepreneurial business, there are certain things that you don't need to do whilst you're a private business that you will need to do as a listed business. So that's the first thing that we always talk about with our clients, because we would rather our private businesses spent their time and energy growing the business, delivering a strategy to put them in a position whereby the business model is fit for purpose for external investors to come in and invest. So that is the same across every territory that you will go to. That private, family-run entrepreneurial businesses as a fact of life, will not have an internal control structure fit for purpose as a PLC, because if they have, then they've probably been spending the time in the wrong areas, and they should have been spending the time growing the business. So in any business, there is always going to be that investment in corporate governance to get through a process. And I echo everything that Nick said around corporate governance. Corporate governance is the full range from having the board in place at the external perspective, right down to have we got the right controls and procedures within the business to create accurate management accounts, etc., etc. So the first thing is, let's all recognise private businesses will need to do some work. The second piece is the actual culture and regulatory environment that you are entering into. So I would not hold my hand up and say that the UK is at the top of the list for regulatory compliance, but wherever it is in the list and wherever the bar is, that's where we need to get to. So, a UK company going into the US trying to achieve Sarbanes-Oxley is a different bar altogether. So what we typically see on our international clients is that there is a sense of helping them understand what the actual level they need to get to for a UK listing. And more often than not, it will be completely different to the territory that they're in. I've actually been around quite a few of our member firms looking at the controls work, because the reality is, if we take one of our clients public, the first thing that I do is go and look at the audit files to see where the gaps are, and that's before I even have the conversation with the client. And I've done this in Korea, China, India, Newcastle, Bolton. I've done it all over the world and all over the UK, and without fail there is that gap in control documentation. So we spotted this as an issue many times ago, and again, one of the things that came out of my presentation, I hope, is that I focus on the detail. No matter what the strategy is, whatever the story is, no matter how great the business is, if you don't meet the bar to get through the UKLA's review of the prospectus, etc., you can't go public. It's a fact of life. It's not like a private equity transaction where there's no hard and fast rules. This is the gold standard. So we saw this many years ago, and the reality is no one likes someone like me turning up after a CEO just give a fantastic presentation about how great the business is and saying, hang on a minute, we don't think you'll get there, or we can get you there, but it's probably 9 months away. So what we did is, and I touched briefly upon it in the presentation, was the IPO readiness piece. So IPO readiness is in effect pre-due diligence for your transaction. And what we do is, when we go in, is specifically look at those key areas where there may be an element of risk. So in the past we would spend probably equal amount of time across all work streams planning them and identifying gaps. Now, just to sum up all the points I've talked about, different regulatory environments and private businesses and not having the right controls, we spend most of our time actually walking through the controls, because we can talk about the things like due diligence will spot whether your KPIs are the right ones, etc., etc. That piece in effect stops when you actually IPO. The piece around controls and corporate governance lives on in the post-IPO world when you're a PLC, and we have lots of conversations in the UK, around who should be checking the PLCs, because at the time of IPO you sign off that everything's in good order, but after that there's no further controls test that you do. So I mentioned Sarbanes-Oxley a couple of times, that's an annual test and the auditor signs off on it. In the UK there isn't. So there is that inherent reliance that the board are doing the right things, not just to get the IPO away, but on a week-to-week, day-to-day basis to maintain that level of internal controls. And the reality is, lots of businesses that come to the UK to IPO will be here in terms of the growth strategy, and will sign off on controls at that level. And then, it's a growth strategy, and a year later they've doubled in size, and there's actually no formal sign-off there's just no other sign-off other than the annual audit, which, as we all know, isn't an express sign-off on control. So having the right corporate governance attitude, tone at the top, attitude to risk it's just got to be living and breathing throughout the organisation, not just at IPO but post-IPO.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. Gaye, given the explanations that Tim has explained about the success factors and most important goals. Can you please let us know a little bit about how the private teams work across international engagements and our experience about how we support private businesses for going public internationally or locally? The most important is, please tell us about how we utilize our resources in our global network.
Thank you, Ali. Hi everyone. Just before I answer your question, maybe just to introduce myself, I am an audit partner in Deloitte, and I am now audit lead of Turkey. So I really enjoyed the presentations up to so far and all the explanations made. Being an auditor for more than 20 years now, I should say that the IPOs and these processes are the most valued or most critical parts in an auditor's life. So I can tell so many stories about what I experienced in successful and unsuccessful IPO trials. At Deloitte, we are operating in 5 offices in Turkey, and we are around 500 people all working in different audits. As you say, we have plenty of private company clients who we audit, like statutory audit or IFRS financials are audited for various reasons. But when it comes to an IPO, it's really the most exciting period of our journey with our clients. We see the energy in the eyes of the CEOs or the boards during that process, and we really try to help as much as we can from day one. There's different characteristics of Turkish business, but we really, I mean, to me, the least developed part is the planning stage, which all other colleagues talked about. Unlike other countries, or I don't know many other countries, but we are a little last-minute people. We are the ones that study exams in the last day. I mean, we really don't. It's a kind of characteristics. We don't like to plan like 9 months ahead what we will do in 9 months. But in businesses and in IPOs especially, we should be there. We should be planning what to do in 9 months, 18 months, 3 years. So there, as Deloitte, we try to talk more about that readiness part with our clients to make it more clear. I call it like having a baby. You can tell it many times, but if you don't have it, you really don't understand what it is. This IPO process is a little that-like. I mean, you may talk about it for 3-4 hours, but if you haven't experienced, you really don't know what it is. So that's why I think you asked any people in the room who tried this and who were successful or not successful. So as auditors, we are trying to resource our teams with the most educated, most experienced teams for those processes, and we work very closely with our London team. We have friends there. They know us and they know our characteristics, so they very well help us on how to communicate the bottlenecks with our clients so that they don't have any surprises in the journey, because no one likes surprises during that process. Everyone wants it to be like easy, flawless. So we as Deloitte, with 1,300 people and more, try to be there, work as a team to make it happen and to make it very successful. A private part is critical because we are growing with that part of economy. Publics are already there. That internal controls and corporate governance issues are very popular in Turkey as well for the last 5-6 years now. Maybe like 10 years ago it was not that popular, but last 5-6 years we've been talking about corporate governance, internal controls and those documentations. It's more known by our clients and their management, I think. So we support together with London team.
Thank you very much for your explanations. Axel, I have a couple of questions for you as well. I enjoyed Tom's presentation for that, and thank you very much for you guys for flying here to London for this event. Well, when we go into the specifics, think about a private business or a family business who is considering going public in the UK. So can you please get into more detail about what market to prefer, what are the advantages of AIM or Elite that Tom was referring to, and what are the reporting requirements from LSE side to start with from the company's perspective?
Yes. Thank you, Ali, for the question. Thank you to all of you also for coming to today's event. It's exciting to have the opportunity to actually meet you and have a face-to-face conversation. As Tom also mentioned, we are big fans of Turkey. We love to be here. I've been now with the exchange for 7 years, so it's always a pleasure to come to this part of the world. I think one just needs to look outside the window to give you a reason why compared to London. Now, London is known for a lot of things, but it's not known for beautiful weather. But one thing it's certainly known for is the vast sort of capital that sits in London, the vast sort of expertise, which we also have here represented on the panel, which exists around financial services. So if you would envisage a city in the world which is related to finance, the first city I think that comes to everyone's mind is London. So with that, I think there's a whole host of opportunities which are open to Turkish companies. As Tom already mentioned, often because London is this big financial sort of center where capitals from all corners of the world are sort of come together and look in terms of which opportunities to invest. Sometimes there's the perception that it's a little bit too far away, or I'm not sure whether my company is going to sort of fit, is going to be big enough for London, etc. Rest assured, we are here because we believe that Turkish entrepreneurs are doing great things. They're growing abroad. They're trying to diversify their business. They are very successful at what they're doing. And I think institutional investors, and we're not just talking about UK institutional investors, we're really talking about global markets. So I'm talking about US investors. We have certain deals, for instance, in London where 30–40% of investment is actually coming from North America, even though it's a London listing. We're talking about UK investors, European investors, Middle Eastern, Asian, which are also fast growing. So you're tapping really into global capital pools. So this is what London is really about. This is the real strength of London. And accordingly, because you have this vast pool of capital, there's also the whole ecosystem which has developed over a very long period of time. So for instance, the London Stock Exchange is an institution which has been around for over 200 years, 221 I think. So it's an incredible amount of time. And accordingly, throughout this time, an ecosystem has formed which is very, very sophisticated. And that ecosystem allows companies of all kinds of sizes and shapes to actually access a very institutional, London is a very institutional market, so we are talking about professional investors. This is some of the difference maybe also to the local market, which has a very high degree of retail investor participation, is very liquid. But London primarily will be an institutional market, so we are talking about getting ready to talk and present and sort of attract professional, long-term investors. This is the core strength of London. And these investors look for different kinds of opportunities. There are investors which look for sort of more traditionally run businesses, large cap businesses, and there are investors who look for exciting innovation, fast growth kind of businesses. And we as an exchange, we have different segments. We have the AIM segment for smaller, fast-growing businesses, which was highlighted, and then we have the main market for these large businesses. To give you an idea of what that means in terms of size, so we have had sort of a distribution. An AIM company, a typical AIM company, will be in terms of market capitalization. What's the cheapest? What's the best currency to mention? Maybe US dollars. Everyone can relate to. Will be about. Let's use pounds. So the average market capitalization of an AIM IPO last year in 2017 was 88 million pounds. And the average raise was around 25 million. So just to give you an idea, so So yes, London is a big market, but it's also a market which sort of caters to this company. So there were companies which were smaller than that, and there were companies which were a bit bigger than that. On the main market, the average market capitalization was around 400 million, between 350 to 500 million roughly. And the average IPO size, so the average amount of money raised at IPO was around 100, 150 million, just to give you an idea. So this already qualifies you for the main market. And I think there is a whole host of Turkish companies which actually fit quite beautifully into those two segments. So that's the opportunity. And in terms of what the criteria are, on the main market, we have quite formal criteria. That's the regulated markets. You need to have, particularly in the premium segment, for instance, you need to have a 3-year financial track record, which most normal businesses will have. And also the beauty in Turkey is that many businesses actually have IFRS numbers. I mean, sometimes I go into the continent, so I'm also responsible for activities in Europe. You go to a sophisticated market like Germany, for instance, they don't have IFRS numbers. I mean, they have German GAAP equivalent. So Turkey has actually already an advantage in a way, and obviously also the expertise of Deloitte and the likes to help along the way to adjust the numbers. But I think Turkey has already a head start in that sense. So in the main market you need IFRS, 3 years minimum financial track record, 25% free float. On the AIM market, for instance, just to contrast that, there's no minimum free float, there's no minimum financial track record, and there's no minimum size requirement. So it's been designed to be as flexible as possible to fast-growing businesses. Now that doesn't mean that you can be a tiny company. But it means that from a regulatory perspective, the framework is there to accommodate various kind of businesses. So there are, of course, sensible amounts, even if you list on AIM, that you will raise in order to attract those institutional investors. So usually, for instance, it's easier to raise a high amount of money than a lower amount of money from institutional investors, which sounds a bit counterintuitive. But the reason is that these big institutional investors, and on AIM, for instance, you have BlackRock, the biggest asset management company in the world, which invests in SMEs. So they have funds dedicated to that. But they won't be able to participate in an IPO, which is just raising $1 million or $2 million, because for them that's just too small. So for them it's actually easier to participate in an IPO fundraise, which is larger, because the ticket size for them is larger. And so it actually makes a difference to the portfolio. So that's a little bit counterintuitive. So you can get access to these blue chip, big institutional investors, which are very long-term strategic almost investors, from a fundraise of 10 million plus, roughly, to give you a number. So that's for instance one of the advantages of AIM. And in terms of free float, for instance, AIM, as I mentioned, doesn't have a minimum free float requirement. Nonetheless, there is sort of what is sensible market practice. So sensible market practice will be around 20-25%, sometimes more, sometimes less. It depends on the company. But it's essentially who the institutional investors are going to be that dictate, and how much money the company is looking to raise, that dictates what the free float really is going to be. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much for all these important tips for companies who are going to are considering going public abroad. So Nick, I know that you have a flight, so I will have a couple of questions for you, quite short. Whenever you have to leave, you may leave. So just to make a quick note. So we heard from Tim about the costs. So can you please tell us about the legal costs of going public? Engagements, So I know that that's not the most fun part of this, but yeah. So please give us a
lawyers' fees are always the most reasonable. But I think that the range that Tim gave is more or less right. Unfortunately, the issuer will be required to pay not only their own counsel's fees, but also the underwriters' counsel's fees as well. Not only that, if you're doing a GDR, you've got to pay for the depository's lawyers' fees as well. So we're probably for a multi-jurisdictional IPO into London, I'd say it's probably at the top end of what Tim was showing, which was $0.7 million upwards, where the lawyers can often be helpful in terms of budget and cash flow, is that it's always the case, it's typically the case that you can ask for a fee cap in order to really have an understanding of budgetary constraints going forward. And from a cash flow perspective, typically the case that we would only, wouldn't interim bill, we would ask the lawyers only to bill at the time of the IPO. That's not to say billing at the time of the IPO equals contingency fee, because I think on your list you've got partial contingency. The lawyers, other than for litigation, the lawyers do not like contingency fees, and our charges, we don't work on a commission basis like the banks do, where we don't see a big upside or a big valuation or downside in case the IPO doesn't happen. So we're typically fixed fees, charging at the time of the IPO, and obviously if the IPO doesn't happen, they would typically still charge, unless what you're able to convince the lawyers is that actually the IPO is not going forward, it's just been delayed.
Yeah. Okay. So, Tim, as you know, all Deloitte Private researchers indicate that private businesses rely on international markets for some part of their revenue or financing. And all those private businesses and family businesses are getting more international and interconnected around the globe. And this is what happens in Turkey as well. Most of our family businesses and private businesses rely on international markets. And as Deloitte Private professionals, we are trying to position ourselves as trusted business advisors to be able to serve those businesses wherever those businesses need us around the globe. So can you please tell us a little bit how you, as a London firm, manage the international engagements?
So I think you quite rightly state that gone are the businesses that are just that list on the London Stock Exchange because the whole business is in the UK. So we are seeing lots of international businesses, and what I've certainly seen over the last 15, 16 years when I've been at Deloitte is that in the past, and I am going back quite a way, we could do form of transaction internationally, but just staying in the UK and maybe outsourcing some of the work to the local office. But the reality is now, with where the regulations are, there is a lot of importance on us as professionals who are signing off all the reports on an IPO, actually really getting to grips with what's happening in the international markets. As I said in the past, we would in effect work with the management team and understand their controls, their processes, procedures around how they control everything from the UK, if that's where the head office was. Now, we will clearly start at that perspective, but then we would actually go and do detailed work around the various jurisdictions with the local Deloitte team to make sure that we are understanding the local picture with local experts, but at the same time, recognising the transaction is going to happen in London and then making sure that we can all bridge the gap between UK standards and international. So that means that a process becomes a lot more interactive, time-consuming. I won't mention cost again, but actually I think what you get is the right answer from a regulatory perspective, but actually the right answer from a client perspective, because we've done many of these transactions where the local, so the head office finance director has been quite comfortable with what he thinks he's getting from the various international businesses. And then when we've gone out and had a conversation, done some work, we've actually been able to enlighten them around what's happening, and maybe things weren't as consistent as you thought they were, deviations from group policies, etc., which in a private business, when things like that come to light, then you can, it's never helpful, but you can minimise the damage. In a public scenario, if there's an accounting black hole in in the US or France, wherever, and the group finance director was not aware of it, then unfortunately he typically loses his job. So what we typically do is make sure that we provide some comfort to the directors, that, you know, not only are they comfortable with all the international pieces, but at the same time we're comfortable as well, and more often than not things do come to light out of that process. But I think it's all around being joined up, working together, and then actually when you do that work as part of the IPO process, as I've said a number of times, it doesn't stop there. You become a PLC. If you can get those good disciplines in, then actually live post-IPO is not as difficult as it would have been trying to unearth these problems in the public markets.
Yeah, thank you. Gaye, as we have discussed a lot of times among our partner group, we as Deloitte Private professionals position ourselves as trusted business advisors rather than just being auditors or consultants, to bring value to our clients, to our business partners, wherever they need, and the best expertise around the globe, and mobilize our network. And I think Tim's presence over here for this presentation is an indication of how we mobilize our resources to bring the value to our clients. So can you please tell us about a little bit the references and experience about those international engagements, to be more specific and tangible, and the potential in Turkey? That's the first one. The second question is the potential in Turkey for international public offerings. Are you receiving additional requests or inquiries?
Thanks, Ali. Actually, the last year was full of IPO projects for us as Deloitte Turkey, together with our UK firm. Before starting with our real experiences, I should say first, we as Deloitte try to concentrate on more what our clients need rather than what we propose them. Because like whatever you try to propose is meaningless if that's not the need from the market. So mainly the counterparties that we talk are the business owners. A financial part is not the best part that they are interested. They mostly focus on the business, growth, sales, expanding to other markets, internationally or locally, but they are not really that much focused on the financial parts or financial reportings, which reflect the results of those operations. To me, it's getting more and more known by the company managements or shareholders that the financial part is not just the historic financial information, but more about the prospective ones. What are the plans? What are the projects after IPO or with other financing models? So we see more finance directors or managers involved in the decision processes in the private market especially. So that makes us more and more, to me, required because they have millions of other duties during their routine, the CFOs or finance controllers. As Deloitte, we are main focus on the new standards, their effects on the financial statements, how they will reflect the results, how they will change the results of the operations, so on and so forth. So we try to be there with the finance team, with the management, both for the historic part, but also for the prospective part for our advisory clients rather than audit clients, because audit clients, due to independence issues, we can't really do this. But for our private clients and private sector, we try to focus on the real need of the companies. And we try to mobilize our expertise, like if they can't really be sure about the IFRS financials, how they are presented, we try to be there with them to understand the results, or if any other reason that our services are required, we are more focusing on the need from the market. So Ali, as you are the lead of the Deloitte Private, that's our our signal to show that we give extra importance to the private market, because their requirements are not just public ones or referral ones. The private group needs other things that we as Deloitte try to focus, whatever they need, whenever they need. So we try to mobilize our teams in not just Istanbul, but we also have offices in Izmir, Ankara, Adana and Bursa. So wherever they are, we try to be there. And last, I want to add to Tim's comment on their working style is more traveling than calling. In the last year, we saw many UK office Deloitte people working in Turkish offices to understand better the clients, the controls, everything, the numbers, the facts behind the numbers. Therefore, we are more and more mobilized. We are not just importing, we are also exporting our Deloitte graduates, what I call. We have so many Turkish friends started working in other offices there, regardless of the weather. Their most preferred location is still London, but there are others in other firms in Europe or US. So we are just importing and exporting data, information, experience to be more and more helpful to our clients in Turkey.
Exactly. So before the Q&A, Axel, a couple of last questions to you that we can manage the time in a better manner. So what are your recommendations to the Turkish entities who are considering going public in the UK? And as a LSE, how do you support those international potential invest issuers in your market?
Yes.
So can they call you, for example? Can they contact you in person, or what's the way for starting a communication?
Yes. No, thank you. Just a quick answer. So the answer is, of course, yes. We are here to be called, to be emailed, called, dined, wined, etc. No, it's very easy. So between Tom, myself, as the team that we have in London, we are in Turkey quite regularly, and we loved coming to this part of the world, as I mentioned before, and it's very easy to have a conversation and get actually quite a good understanding of what the possibilities are for your company, for your business, in terms of, is London the right venue? Is Bursa the right venue? Is an IPO the right thing for me to do? Those are very, very important questions, and the answer will differ from company to company. And we are really here to help you explore what the right thing, to get more information than for you to actually decide what the right decision might be. And the best thing, we heard a lot about costs beforehand, but actually the process of finding out and evaluating what the potential route might be doesn't cost anything, or almost anything, other than sort of your time commitment and wanting to find out more. So we are available here. We have great partners here. There's a great amount of expertise which sits here in Turkey. Obviously, we have colleagues here on the panel. There have been IPOs which have been done very successfully here in Turkey, so I think that's a knowledge base to tap into. But equally, it's very easy to sort of jump on a plane nowadays on the Pegasus airline. It costs 50 quid to get to London, and have conversations there and get a real sense in terms of what do other people think, not just the guys who are sitting here on the panel, but actually what do sort of investors potentially think, etc. And we are as an exchange, we're here to help create that connectivity. So we are. This is what the exchange does. It's essentially a match. It's a bit like a dating platform, essentially. On one hand, you have companies, on the other hand, you have investors, and you want to bring the two together. And we are here to create this connectivity, and we're here to help. So please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or colleagues, or if there's anyone you want to meet in London, we pretty much know everything. The second thing I would mention is that we have events which we are running all the time. So thank God also to our partners who have been so kind of sort of to support us in this initiative to be here today. But equally we run also events in London. So for instance, tomorrow we will have our flagship conference on Eastern Europe, essentially CIS, CE, Russia, sort of big topics nowadays. So we have a full day conference in London, and we'll have the who is who of the region basically gathering at the London Stock Exchange. A month ago, we had a conference around fintech. Fintech is a big buzzword nowadays. We had a panel specifically on Turkey. So we had the CEO of Isiko, Barbaros here, and we had Istanbul FinTech, sort of the co-founder of Istanbul FinTech, the organization which supports the FinTech community here. So we had a panel just on that, for instance, so anyone who's interested in FinTech could have come there. The month before, we partnered with Global Turk. Paris is also here in the audience today, and we invited the Turkish private equity community to engage with the London investors and community and private equity community. So there is a lot of engagement, and we are more than happy to invite you and sort of so you see firsthand and be part of that. So yes, the opportunities, just to say from an institutional investors, why are we going through all these efforts? Because the opportunities are very, very real. So we are not here just beating the drum and saying let's do this, but actually we've seen very, very tangible sort of success of last year of the companies that have been mentioned before, and we also see sort of traction this year. So just the companies that you've seen last year won't have been the last companies. We are aware of a couple of companies which are sort of working towards it. And the reason is that London's institutional investors are looking for growth opportunities. In Turkey is one of the fastest growing regions on the planet. China is just slightly ahead, but otherwise Turkey is very close to London and is part of Europe. So for institutional investors it's very, very easy to get an understanding, A, because they are already invested in the region, B, they are already invested in companies which are in the same sector, which you guys are operating. We've got 2,300 companies of all sizes listed in London. So for institutional investors, it's very easy to have this connectivity and understand very well what Turkish companies are about, what sectors they're operating, what the challenges are, what the opportunities are. So that means for Turkish companies, the opportunities are very, very real, and that's why it makes sense for us to try and be as helpful as we can. Yeah.
Thank you very much, quite exactly. So let's do a Q&A session. Let's receive a couple of quick questions from the audience if you want to ask any. And please keep in mind that we will be around after the event, that you would like to talk in person. Any questions from the audience? Please.
I'd like to ask a question to you. My name is Zayn, I'm working for Department of International Trade. My job is to invest in the UK. So I tend to deal with a lot of Turkish corporates in various sizes, but most of them are like small to medium sizes. And of course, money is very scarce, so they're looking after financing. What I'm trying to understand is what is the rationale for a Turkish company to go to the AIM markets rather than going to private equity or venture capital, or is it the last stage of raising funding, or is it the consecutive stage of raising funding? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think it's a very good question in terms of at one point does a company think about capital markets as it grows, and some companies are smaller. I think the fascinating thing about AIM is that sometimes it can be almost taken like a venture capital sort of investor as well. So there are things which we call venture capital trusts. They're essentially funds which raise the money on the public market and reinvest the money as a venture capital sort of firm would, just that they're public vehicles. And there are certain tax advantages of actually investing in that. So there are venture capital-like investors, so AIM can be almost like a venture capital sort of fund itself. But equally, AIM is a growth market, so what it lends itself most to is to companies which are beyond the startup phase and actually want to scale successfully. So whether it's technological development or geographic expansion, it's really about growth capital. That's the real strength. I mean, the average AIM company, which we've been talking a lot about IPOs, but actually IPO is just one point in time. So it's one point in time where a company raises capital, but the average AIM company raises capital 4 times. So all the costs that we've heard about, you can divide it by 4 essentially for each single fundraise, almost. Because once you are on the market, once you have attracted those long-term investors, it's quite easy to come back and sort of bring them back in. So we've seen, to be honest, on AIM, there are over 1,000 companies listed on AIM, so there are kinds of sectors and sizes represented, but we've seen companies as small as £20 million market cap be successful because they are sometimes very, very successful. The company which comes to mind is LoopUp, for instance, which is, they do teleconference software. So nowadays, sometimes all you will be familiar, you're on a teleconference, sometimes there are 5-6 people on the call and you don't always know who is speaking right now, so they have a software where you know exactly what's going on, you can make recordings, etc. So they listed as a small business in London, and they brought in some blue-chip institutional investors. They listed last year. Share price is up over 60% in a relative short period of time. The year before, we had a slightly more extreme example of a fintech company, quite a small fintech company. They have the biggest virtual workforce. They have like a virtual workforce. Basically, they use software to automate a lot of mundane things within sort of banks. And their share price, they're called Blue Prism, their share price is up over 1,000%. So they went from a sub 100 million pound business to over $1 billion now in a short period of time. So this is an extreme example, but it showcases when you tap into what investors are interested in, then investors, you perform, you meet what you set out, because one of the things that we mentioned is about equity story, but once you're on the market, you also need to basically meet the targets that you've set during the roadshow, that you have communicated to investors. That's extremely, extremely important. If you do that, then usually you have a very positive share price development. It's very easy to then bring in additional money if you want to acquire other businesses, etc. So that's the beauty of being on capital markets. It gives you access to long-term capital. These institutional investors are pension funds, insurance companies, or big institutional investors. They usually, on AIM, invest with a view to not just sell the next week. They're not hedge funds. They are long-term thinkers. So it's about strategic capital, essentially. It's patient capital. It allows you as the business, as the management team, to continue to run the business and focus on the business, which is quite different to having private equity or venture capital on board, which is often much more hands-on. You might have different ideas in terms of how to run the business or where to take the business. So the beauty of capital markets is that you have this access to capital, but at the same time you can focus on running your own thing. And you do well, you have more access to capital, and you can buy other businesses, etc.
Sir?
We were talking about the process, and we all understand now that the corporate governance is available to any IPO. We've not touched on that for another session, but the question that we were getting asked when we were doing the roadshow, why you're raising capital? What's it going to do with institutions to grow? To drive growth, to grow business, for investors are looking for. And I mean, how do you see advising potential organizations who are open to focus very clearly on giving very robust marketing proposal that actually shows clearly why you what that capital is actually going to do to drive growth?
Yeah. If you don't mind, I would like to answer this question from Turkish market perspective. So, I think it's all clear to all participants that our growing model is relies on debt, and the equity of the companies, especially in manufacturing and core industry, is not that strong to carry that debt level. So, given the globalization of the markets, it's crucial and it's more important than we think to have access to cheaper sources of financing to stay alive, to be more sustainable. So if we cannot manage our finance expenses, we cannot be competitive from financing perspective as well. As the Turkish companies, we will have difficulty in sustaining our business, and we will lose all our profits that we generated through our manufacturing process to the financing institutions. So the references given in this presentation from corporate governance, risk management, internal controls, good governance structures, implementation of good governance structures in the Turkish marketplace allows us to gives access to the more mature markets, which gives us the ability to utilize cheaper sources of funding in such an environment. So thank you very much for this question, sir. It's such an important question from the sustainable perspective of Turkish economy and moving forward. Gaye, would you like to add anything on top of this?
I think it's whatever you told, I all agree. So in the last 6 months, it's always told not to borrow more from the financial institutions, but rather find a better partner, a shareholder, or long-term investor. So everything is highly competitive. Being strong and strong is critical. Finance is one of the reasons. I mean, sustainable and long-term financing, I guess, is critical. So that's why I think they prefer more and more.
Ali, can I just chip in?
Yeah, please add.
So I think it's a great question, because I think pre-UK recession, when there was the dot-com booms and there was lots of IPOs, I think the type of meetings that we would have with clients would be, we would ask, how much are you going to raise and what are you going to use it for? And some of the worst meetings have ever been with a reply saying, how much can we get? And at that time, then potentially you would get your IPO away because there was lots of money in the market. It was pre-recession. Post the recession, when the capital markets had in effect contracted and were reopening, and investors really had to choose wisely where they put the funds, that question around what are you going to do with it became more and more important. So it became the first thing that we talked about in terms of, right, we're going to raise £50 million, of which £5 million will go into general working capital, but the other £45 million is going to do X, Y, and Z, and it's going to grow the business by Y%. And the reason why you can believe us is because we've done it 3 times before with our own funding, own cash flows. All the other work proves that we're a credible management team, and you do actually have to build that story up to actually get the investors on board, that by them writing a cheque to you, you've got the credibility of the management team, you've got a proper plan, you've done it before, and actually there's minimal risk that it won't actually come off. So it's the whole mindset to that particular question has completely changed just in reaction to the markets.
Let's receive one last question, then have other questions after our event, please, sir.
My name is Alan Miles, I'm Chairman of the Chamber. My day job is executive search. So I'm spending, obviously, my time recruiting top management at various levels. In Turkey, yes, they talk about corporate governance, board members, but mainly they are picked amongst friends of the owners of private companies. It's very rare that a private company will say, Alan, we need a non-executive board member with this X, Y, Z expertise. For an IPO, obviously, corporate governance being very important, what would be the minimum number of non-executive board members, and what would be the expertise amongst those non-executive board members? I mean, presumably finance, but what else?
And you want independent non-executive directors. So really splits into a few things. So investor expectation is very different through the different segments. I think at the very say the lowest, but in the GDR world, in the emerging market, developing market companies that we list in London, I think the expectation is that we typically have at least 2 INAs on a board, irrespective of the size of the board. So there are local requirements in different countries about having a minimum number of INAs on board. Irrespective of that, for a London GDR investor, you typically want to see 2 INAs. It would be unusual if you're doing a premium listing, and even a standard share listing with aspirations to move up to premium, to move into even possibly FTSE indexation, it would be unusual not to meet the full 50% of at least half criteria. There are factors that aggravate and mitigate that, so it's definitely possible at the time of an IPO, you're in a growth trajectory, for you to be able to explain very understandably to investors that, again, the aspiration of the company is to move to full compliance over a period of time, even if at the time of the IPO you don't have the full complement of INEDs on the board. Aggravating factors, we were talking about market expectation, investor expectation. An aggravating factor where actually the UKLA would be interested in not only board balance, but actually the calibre of person on the board, and they would look at the type of person, is when you have a controlling shareholder, which is a lot of the scenarios that we're talking about here with family ownership. At that point, additional rules apply. But in addition to those additional rules, really what the UKLA will be looking for is a strong chairman and strong independence, which will really speak up for the minority investors. And for that does take some time. It's not a quick process, as obviously you're aware. In terms of specific qualifications, for a good equity story, strong management with a compensation package aligned with the long-term shareholder value. But for the INEDs in particular, it's really whatever industry experience as well as financial experience that they would bring to the board. Industry experience is a given, that is added value. From a financial perspective, you would always have an audit committee of at least one member who needs to have a financial or audit background. So strong calibre, good independence, Western facing, particularly if it's a premium listing, and also some financial competence as well.
My sector is going to thank you too. Thank you.
So, thank you very much for coming. There is one question.
If I may, please. Hasan Kılıç from Deloitte. Tim, you said that there are lots to do, especially in the work streams, and I'm sure that there are millions of tick boxes over there for every single work stream. And as Alan's, and iterating the Alan's question of challenges, what are the main, let's say, highlights of the challenges coming from the shareholders? Because those private businesses generally driven by a single person or group of people, either they are king or queens, most of the time everybody around them self-serving them and asking what they are asking what to do. And accordingly, of course, compliance with the requirements of opening their companies into public requires a lot of challenges. And some of them are substance, some of them form. And I will be asking the view of London Stock Exchange, especially those for the form rather than the substance, because substance certainly should be there. And when it comes to having a great project like opening their companies abroad, what are the main messages you would give to professionals here that they would take it to their kings and queens? Thank you.
So the challenge around, I suppose, dominant shareholders is always an interesting one. And to be honest, I don't think it's any different than what we would have in the UK. And ultimately, as I said earlier in the session, that getting through an IPO process is a legal process. It's not like a private equity transaction or a trade sale to a competitor where there's flexibility with the process. You have got the listing rules and the prospectus directive to follow, and you are required to make certain statements to the stock exchange, which the sponsor, you will go back to back with the sponsor on. So it is a high bar, and if you don't meet that high bar, then there's actually no prizes for second place in terms of, well, we have made some progress, so is that not good enough? You do need to meet the required standards, so they are always very tricky meetings, but what we tend to do is have the conversation well in advance, lay out the roadmap of where the business is now, where it needs to get to. Quite clearly, in a number of these situations, the exiting shareholder will be getting a pretty big check at the end of it, and you kind of laid out and explained to them, going public is not for everybody. If you do want to go public, then these are the steps that you'll need to go through, these are the behaviours that you'll need to change. But ultimately, it's a choice as to whether you want to invest in the cost and the time and the resource to do it. So I would never say that they are my favourite meetings, but ultimately, it's better having that conversation 12 months prior to, so say you're kind of 2 months before impact and there's an issue that could have been raised earlier. It's better to have had the conversation earlier. They can make a decision rather than, in effect, building up time and cost and then deciding that actually this is not for me because I didn't really understand the full consequences. So it's definitely a difficult one, and there's an education piece, which is why, the days of starting a project and then expecting the impact to be 3 months later without any planning, those days are disappearing because you just can't do that anymore.
So would you like to close our session, that we can continue with questions afterwards? So we are running out of our time, so would you be so kind to end our session, please?
It's been a wonderful session, and I'm sure you've all benefited from the experience that our panel have got. I'm sure it'll stimulate your minds and raise your appetite for a potential IPO in London. I think this discussion has got another stage to go through, and we do have, as I say, the best of the best to advise us on that particular journey. So I'd just like you to show your appreciation in the usual way for our wonderful panel and the other speakers that we've enjoyed so much today. So thank you very much. Thank you.